G'day everybody and welcome to another Scott Poynton podcast. And in this podcast, I'm going to be talking about something that's a little bit boring in a way. It's the European Deforestation Regulation, otherwise known as EUDR. And a lot of listeners to my podcast will know that I have a long history of working in efforts to try and prevent deforestation, going right back to the early days when I set up the Tropical Forest Trust back in 1999. TFT, as we called it, our mission back then was really to get forests better protected, to stamp out illegal logging, which was a scourge affecting so many forests, particularly in the tropics back in those days, really through the 80s and 90s and 60s and 70s. There'd been a lot of deforestation for industrial purposes. And then really in the 90s and 80s, 90s, 2000s, there's a lot of illegal logging as companies pushed into forest areas, national parks to try and get access to timber that they could then bring into the European and international US, other markets and profit from. And this was a terrible thing and caused a lot of deforestation. And TFT was part of a broad effort to try and stop that. And we came at it by working with companies. We tried to help companies pioneer and innovate around this whole concept of responsible sourcing. Where do you get your raw materials from? Is it linked to deforestation? Is it linked to human rights abuses? That work unfolded during the 2000s, where we worked to get forests certified, sustainably certified, and to connect companies to those forests so that and with traceability systems to prove that that's where the wood was coming from. This work took on a whole new level when we started working with Nestlé back in 2010, and we mediated the world's first no deforestation commitment between Nestlé and Greenpeace. Greenpeace attacked Nestlé for being linked to deforestation in the palm oil sector back in March 2010, and then I was able to work with the Nestlé procurement team to devise and propose the world's first no deforestation commitment, and that was published in May 2010, May 17th, 2010. A big moment for the world's forests. Not many companies rushed to follow. The Consumer Goods Forum here in Europe made some statement at the end of 2010, vague reference to stamping out deforestation. But then over the subsequent years, in 2011, Golden Agri-Resources, Indonesia's largest palm oil company, came out with their no deforestation commitment, another project that I worked on where I mediated the dispute between Greenpeace and Golden Agri-Resources. And that was the first palm oil company to come out with a no deforestation commitment. And again, I was excited by that, to think that the rest of the industry would have to follow. Well, they didn't. And this was a surprise to me. Part of the reason they didn't was because they had the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, a certification scheme that gave them cover. And whilst they stayed under the RSPO banner, even though it was quite a weak standard at the time, then the companies felt protected because large NGOs like WWF were also involved in the RSPO. Nonetheless, Asia Pulp and Paper was the next major company to come forward with a no deforestation commitment, and they announced their commitment in February 2013. And APP was their acronym. It's a sister company to Golden Agri-Resources in the pulp and paper sector. And they'd been campaigned against for decades by NGOs for their links to forest destruction in Indonesia, particularly Sumatra and Kalimantan, in very, very important forest areas with a lot of flagship endangered species. But also there were accusations of human rights abuses as well. And that was a long, drawn-out process. But again, EPP came forth with a very strong no deforestation, no exploitation policy and no peatland clearance policy. But the real move came at the end of 2013 when Wilmar International, the world's largest palm oil company, signed on to a very far-reaching no deforestation, no exploitation, and no peatland clearance policy that I wrote for them and then mediated with Mighty Earth, what became Mighty Earth Climate Advisors at the time. Glenn Horowitz had led that campaign calling on Wilmar to take strong action. And they did. And this was a great breakthrough because once Wilmar went, the whole palm oil industry had to follow. And what happened with all of that work was, even though that was back in 2013, it took some time, but the global environmental movement caught on to this idea that, well, if companies could do that in palm oil, why couldn't they do it with other commodities? And this eventually led to, well, it was part of the process that led to the start of the European Deforestation Regulation process, which probably kicked off. I wasn't involved in it, but I think it was around 2019. There's a lot of, pushing for this regulation to come into being, and a lot of gathering of signatures, gathering of interest. Basically, this led to, in June 2023, European Deforestation Regulation, EUDR, came into force. It wasn't due to be implemented until the end of 2024, but it came into force with much celebration from the global environmental movement, because here was a very strong law, strong teeth, very strict penalties for companies that were found to be in breach of the EUDR by bringing commodities linked to deforestation into the European market. And there was a number of commodities. So there was cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, soy, rubber and timber, and derivatives of each of those commodities. If you were found to be bringing in part of that commodity or something that was linked to deforestation, a derivative linked to deforestation, the penalties were severe and included fines of up to 5% of the company turnover. So you can imagine all of the large companies, that big traders, producers of these products like chocolate, they were having a bit of a nervous breakdown about this. But I must say, to many companies' credit, they said, all right, well, we don't want to be linked to deforestation. This is the case. So let's put in place the required steps to prove that we're not and that we can be compliant with this regulation. And a lot of companies did that. The palm oil industry was already well ahead based on the work that they'd done in response to the Nestlé, Golden Agri-Resources and Wilmar commitments back in 2013. So they were in a good place, but there was a lot of catch-up needed to be done by other commodities. And still, today, as we're in 2026, a lot of those other commodities that come under the banner of the EUDR are not well placed to be compliant with it. So what's happened since? You would think that all very exciting, the regulation would come into force, but it didn't. Due to come in at the end of December 2024, it was delayed to the end of December 2025. And in the second half of last year, it was delayed to the end of 2026, with much concerns, much outcry from NGOs, because they feel that there's a risk that it's going to be watered down, that it might be scrapped altogether. And they would see this as a great setback in efforts to protect the world's forest, which, to be fair to them, may be true. But that requires us to be confident and to be comfortable that we believe that the EUDR is indeed fit for purpose and that it will stop deforestation. We have to ask ourselves, why is there so much pushback against it? Because most companies, I think that's fair to say, that most companies don't want to be linked to deforestation. They don't want to be linked to human rights abuses. They don't want to be linked to pollution. Here in Europe in particular, we're seeing in the US perhaps where the government is pulling back from such commitments, but it doesn't necessarily mean companies are. And here in Europe, I think the push for these things is much stronger. So what's happened nonetheless is that there has been lobbying by a lot of industries against the EUDR, and the governments are listening to them. The NGOs are assuming that's because the companies are evil and that they do want to be linked to deforestation, which is not necessarily the case. What companies are finding is that, and part of the reason why the regulations implementation was delayed from the end of 2024 to the end of 2025 was because the European Commission hadn't yet prepared guidance on how to implement it, on how it would be enforced. And so companies said, well, you haven't even given us the guidelines. How do we know how we're supposed to properly enforce it? And they had a valid point. The concern a lot of companies have expressed is that not only should it be not linked to deforestation, the commodities must be proven to have been legally produced. Again, from a philosophical point of view, who would disagree with that? We don't want illegally sourced commodities coming into the European Union. We don't want commodities linked to deforestation coming in, but how to prove it. So traceability is an important part of that. Show where the commodity comes from. And many companies have done a huge amount of work to put in place these traceability systems to verify exactly that, which is terrific. So when the EUDR was delayed, a number of companies who had prepared very strongly for the implementation date were dismayed that they'd spent so much money, so much time getting ready, and yet here it was delayed. And they were concerned that this wasn't great for their industries because, for example, in the cocoa sector, where there is deforestation for the establishment of cocoa plantations in the tropics, the leaders in the cocoa sector were saying, well, no, we need to get this out. This is not good for our industry. We have to remove deforestation from our commodity footprint. As a consequence, there was quite some outcry when the EUDR was delayed. And yet, here's the thing. Quite fascinatingly, I was able to travel to Nigeria in December 2025, just before Christmas. And what I found there really raised alarm bells for me. Now, the EUDR was supposed to have come into force at the end of December 2025. Here I was just before that date. Now, We know that at that stage, the regulation had been delayed to 2026. But I went out into the field, into a cocoa growing area in Cross River State, Nigeria, very large cocoa area where huge amounts of cocoa is produced and sent to global markets, including the EU, through the traditional trading system. And I met many, many farmers, and not one of those farmers had ever heard of the EUDR. And this is a great concern. And not only that, the farmers were proudly telling me how excited they were to be able to expand their production into new areas of forest. Oh, we've got lots of forest here, they said, and we're able to expand, and this will improve our livelihoods because we'll get more income. And they were excited about it. And here I was on a project to try and implement a traceability system to help these farmers prove that their cocoa was compliant with the EUDR. And yet I found a situation where they had no idea what the EUDR is, and not only that, they were in fact pushing into new areas of forest and were involved in deforestation. So far from helping these farmers, we may have been in a situation where we were causing them to lose access to the European market because we were proving that their cocoa had indeed been linked to deforestation. So it was quite a mess and quite a surprise for me. So soon, so just before the deadline of implementation, these farmers knew nothing about it. What was going on? And there was quite some concern from the farmers. Well, if we can't expand our plantation areas, how are we going to improve our livelihoods? And then, of course, comes the question, well, okay, you can benefit from assistance programs that help you improve the yields on your existing plantations. Traditionally, smallholder farmers have quite low yields. And with support and technical assistance and assistance with inputs, they can improve their yields. And this is what, again, many of the leading companies in this space are doing. They're bringing assistance and extension services to the farmers to help them increase the yields on their existing lands so they don't have to push into new forest areas. But in the absence of that assistance, these farmers are saying, well, what are we going to do here? You're telling us we can't expand, and yet no one's coming to support us to increase our yields. So there was quite some concern, and I understand that. And in the face of that, we have to ask ourselves, could there be some perverse impacts from the EUDR if it's implemented as it is currently envisaged? And I think the answer is a very strong yes. If those farmers there in Cross River State and in other parts of the world can no longer gain access to the European market, they will be obliged to sell their products, their commodities, into other markets that do not really care whether there's deforestation or not. And traditionally, those markets aren't as great in terms of the price they pay. The payment terms are not great. And there's a great risk that to replace the income that the farmers would otherwise have made by selling their commodities into Europe, they will have to increase their deforestation. They'll have to clear more land to plant more crops to get the same amount of money. So indeed, the European Deforestation Regulation could end up accelerating deforestation in some parts of the world linked to some commodities. And you can see this when you go walking around and start talking to farmers. And here is the question. Did anyone ever talk to those farmers? And I think this is where a lot of companies are pushing back against the EUDR. They're saying, no one really ever spoke to us when we were putting the regulation together. It was very much led by large NGOs like WWF, lobbying the European Parliament to put this regulation in place. And I don't think that is something that we can criticise them for. I think, as I've said, most people want to see commodities coming into Europe to be deforestation-free and to be legally sourced. But did anyone ever talk to the companies involved with the commodity trade about how to implement such a thing? And as people have grappled with this, I think they realise there's a lot of challenges. And some companies are able to embrace those challenges. Other companies are a bit lost. But when it gets pushed back down the supply chain, ultimately it's the farmers at the far end of the supply chain who risk losing the most, specifically their livelihoods, as I found out when I was in Nigeria. So I came away from there, and I don't think anyone can question my commitment to the work to stop deforestation. As I said, the work we did at TFT really was a precursor to the EUDR. But here we are, standing on pretty murky ground. And one of the things that I learned when I went to forestry school is that forestry and forest conservation, forest management, is not about trees. It's about people. And if we think that we can disenfranchise smallholder farmers out in the tropical countries where there's great poverty and that this will lead to forest protection, I think we're kidding ourselves. This is a really fundamental issue. One of the concerns that I have is that the big NGOs like WWF, who were so involved in the development of the EUDR, have a strong policy of forest conservation by excluding people. They've done this in national parks, particularly in Africa, but elsewhere in the world, where Indigenous people have been moved out of national parks because we have to have the forest completely free of humans for it to be properly conserved, seems to be their philosophy. And yet here in Europe, there's large areas of land in national parks that have farmers in them, have communities and have towns in them. And there is concern in Europe around that from a lot of NGOs. Again, excluding people leads to conservation, seems to be their mantra. And yet here in Europe, we have programs where those national parks, those reserves, where people are involved, they seem to be doing pretty good. So we are happy to do that here in Europe, but we are asking farmers in developing countries around the world to exclude themselves from being in forests. And I think it's going to be a mess. What to do about it? Well, there's going to be a review of the EUDR in April of 2026, but what sort of review? That's going to be interesting. I'm not involved in these processes, heaven forbid. They're very complex negotiation processes, and there's a lot of lobbying. And, there's a lot of, when you have lobbying, you have one side fighting with the other. From my experience, not much good ever comes of that. Not much that is useful comes of that. You create winners and you create losers. And one of the things that I was thinking about while I was in Nigeria is, how do we go about the process to bring around into being the world's first no deforestation commitments? They were all rather grueling processes where NGOs concerned for forest conservation had attacked companies that they accused of being linked to deforestation, and in many cases human rights abuses as well. And then there was a process of fighting and unhappiness as the market campaign roared around the world. And then I was able to get involved and help these companies understand what they were being charged with, and then to look at what they might be able to do to avoid it. And they were very stressful times, because in many cases the campaigns were very effective in impacting the company's bottom lines. Companies were losing a lot of business. And yet we found a way of helping those companies find calm and understand what they wanted to do. What direction did they want to travel in? I famously asked Nestlé, do you want to be linked to the death of orangutans? No, we don't. Other companies, do you want to be linked to the extinction of the Sumatran tiger? No, we don't. Do you want to be linked to human rights abuses? No, we don't. Happily, on every occasion, the answer was no, we don't. And then it was like, well, what do you want to be linked to? And out of that came the first drafts of the no deforestation, no exploitation, and no peatland clearance policies. It came from the companies themselves. And then it came to sitting down with the NGOs like Greenpeace, like Climate Advisors and now Mighty Earth, and saying, okay, where do we think you could strengthen this? How could this be implemented? And out of that came policies that are still being implemented today, where we see in Indonesia a significant drop in the rate of deforestation linked to palm oil. And I wonder if there are lessons that we can learn from those processes that are relevant to what might happen with the EUDR going forward. I think that process, very imperfect process of getting players together and having a discussion, not necessarily all in one room at first, but having a process by which people are able to express themselves, express their concerns, express their hopes, express their aspiration for the future, all the way along the supply chain. In the palm oil case, the smallholder farmers were engaged by companies in the NDPE, they call them NDPs, no deforestation, peatland and exploitation policies, NDPE policies. As a result of that, all the companies that were implementing those policies went out into their supply chain and worked with the smallholder farmers. And they did bring empowerment inputs to help the smallholder farmers stay away from forest areas. It's had a massive and positive impact. Why can't we do the same with the EUDR? And I think one of the challenges that we face with the EUDR is that it is a legal instrument. It is a blunt instrument, and you cannot have any grey when it comes to legal instruments. Border police, when the product lands at the customs desk, they must be able to have a 1 or 0 situation. Was it linked to deforestation or not? Now, the implementation of that's going to be pretty challenging, and I think that's part of why the whole thing's still being delayed, because they're trying to work out how to do that. But it has to be a 1 or a 0. And it was interesting when I was in Nigeria, a lot of the farmers said, well, we haven't it's not 100% deforestation. We leave trees. We take down some of the trees in the forest, but we leave a number of trees standing so that they provide shade to the cocoa, because the cocoa won't grow if it's completely deforested. We need shade. So, could we plant a few of those trees back? What if we plant some trees somewhere else? And of course, this was farmers being logical and searching for solutions. And yet the challenge they face and the disappointing news that I had to give them was, unfortunately, no. The EUDR is actually not so much about deforestation when it comes to determining how it should be policed. It's actually around land use change. And the regulation requires that from December 31st, 2020, there's no land use change from forest to agriculture. Even if you only fell a few trees, but the land moves from being a forest to a cocoa plantation, I'm sorry, that's land use change. You cannot sell cocoa from that plot into Europe. And that's why I say, as a legal instrument, it's a 1 or a 0. Have you had land use change or not? So then this opens up all sorts of ethical questions around countries' sovereignty. And so is it okay for the EU to say to a smallholder farmer in Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Indonesia, anywhere in the world, sorry, you can't control your own land use. You cannot deforest to increase your agriculture production. Big discussion there around whether that's okay or not. And therefore, obviously, we don't want deforestation, but how are we going to police it if what we're asking farmers to do really infringes on their rights, their free rights to do with their land what they want to do? And of course, the pushback commonly is, well, you guys in Europe deforested all of your areas, 200 years ago, right? So there's intergenerational questions here as well. Ultimately, we're in a bit of a mess. I think that the EUDR has very, very rocky ground and difficult times ahead, which is a shame. We want to prevent deforestation, but I think there needs to be a broader discussion where parties are asked what they think should be done, and there should be some sort of mediation process unfold, like we had between the NGOs and the companies back in 2010, 11, 12, and 13, which gave rise to the first no deforestation commitments. Instead of organisations like WWF, who want to preserve forests by moving people out, having such a strong voice in the setting of these laws, maybe we do need to listen to what the companies say and stop assuming that the companies just want to chop down the forests. It's an imperfect situation. The world is grey. Instruments like legal instruments that require the world to be black or white don't work in that context. And I think that's what we're seeing with the EUDR. So a complex situation, not necessarily any solutions offered here, other than a suggestion that people need to speak. And they need to speak without accusation of immoral behaviour. Just because a company asks for a consideration around the EUDR and expresses concern around how it will be implemented doesn't mean they're pro-deforestation and the destruction of the world's forests. Right. And likewise with NGOs, because they're concerned about forests, doesn't mean they're anti-business. These people collectively can come together and, I believe, find a way forward. And there are many lessons from the NDPE process of the early 2010s, which could help frame a process to bring greater clarity to what the European Union is trying to do, and a spirit of partnership between companies, NGOs, developing country governments, and the people out there who are growing the commodities, so that we can work out how to go forward and come up with a process that does protect forests, does improve farmer livelihoods, does generate revenue for governments and traders and the whole process. And we can have maybe not a capital WIN win, but a small letter win-win-win. There has to be compromise from all parties. And I think what we're seeing now is a lot of fear-mongering that if there's any discussion around the EUDR, then the whole world's forests will go up in smoke. Well, they're under pressure, that's for sure. And this is a great concern to me and to everyone else. But I think the current trajectory we're on with the EUDR isn't going to solve that problem. And of course, it was never going to solve that problem. But the idea was that it could contribute to solving that problem. And what I'm seeing is that, in fact, it could be contributing to making it worse. That's my reflection on EUDR this quiet morning here in Switzerland. The snow is falling outside. It's a long way from the tropical regions where this deforestation is happening. But we must connect to those people out there and understand their situation and their livelihoods if our work to protect forest is to have any hope. Thanks very much for listening. And I look forward to exploring what happens with the EUDR and other legislation to protect the world's forests and promote smallholder farmer livelihoods in the future. Thank you.